All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're looking at a story that's kind of like a political thriller.
Oh.
Seriously.
Yeah.
We're talking secret meetings, accusations of treason even, and maybe even a proxy war brewing, and it's all happening around the Tigray region in Ethiopia.
Sounds complicated.
Oh, it is. It's a really complex situation, and to get the full picture, we got to go back and look at the history between Ethiopia and Eritrea, right? It's a long and often a troubled one.
Absolutely. That's key to understanding what's going on now.
Yeah, and our main source, an article from Africa Intelligence, lays it all out. It's from February 24th, 2025, and the title is Get This, Tigray Leaders Dangerously Torn Between Addis Ababa and Asmara.
Catchy title.
Right. So this isn't just a simple border dispute. There's a lot of history here.
So much baggage.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eritrea actually gained independence from Ethiopia back in 1993, and that was after a really long and bloody fight, too.
Wow. So they fought for independence and then, what, just went right back to fighting each other.
Right. Pretty much. There were still border disputes and political tension, simmering under the surface. And then just a few years later, in 1998, bam, a full-blown border war breaks out.
So from fighting for freedom to fighting each other almost immediately, you mentioned that this war had a lasting impact. What were some of the long-term consequences?
Well, obviously, there was the tragic loss of life and all the people who were displaced. But beyond that, it really cemented this deep mistrust and resentment between the two countries. And we have to remember that this is the context for the more recent Tigray conflict. That was another awful civil war from 2020 to 2022.
Right, 2 civil wars back to back. And in that second one, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, were fighting against both the Ethiopian and Eritrean armies, right?
Exactly. So you've got this historical tension between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Then you add in the Tigray region, which is already devastated from the war.
And here's the kicker. The Tigrayan leadership itself is divided. It's like adding another layer of instability to an already volatile situation. Okay, so it's like a powder keg, ready to blow. And the article suggests that a big part of that instability comes from the fact that the Tigrayan leadership is fractured.
Yeah, exactly. The article points to these two figures, Getachew Reda and Debretsion. Michael Getachew is the president of the Tigray Interim Administration, and Debretsion leads the TPLF. And they have very different ideas about how to deal with all of this.
Yeah, it's interesting because the article describes Getachew Reda as being pretty close with the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. But then on the other hand, he's been accused of treason by some Tigrayan officers. He was even expelled from the TPLF Central Committee.
Right, like where do his loyalties lie? It really shows how much distrust there is and just how delicate the situation is. I mean, imagine trying to lead a region that's just been through a war and being accused of betraying your people by siding with the very government they were fighting against.
Yeah, tough spot to be in. You got to wonder how much power Getachew actually has and if his relationship with Abiy is actually helping him or making things worse.
Definitely adds a lot of uncertainty to the mix. So we have Getachew in a difficult position, but what about Debretsion Michael? What's his take on all this?
Right, where does he fit in?
Well, Debretsion's playing a different game. He's been publicly denying any negotiations with Eritrea, and he's been working hard to reassure Western diplomats that he's all about internal mediation efforts.
Trying to smooth things over from the inside.
Yeah, but we can't forget that he's the leader of the group that was targeted by both Ethiopia and Eritrea in the last civil war.
True, so it's understandable that he'd be hesitant, especially when it comes to Eritrea.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting, almost unbelievable. The article mentions these secret meetings that have been happening between Tigray Defense Forces officers and, get this, Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki.
Whoa, wait a minute. These guys were at war just a few years ago, so what in the world could be motivating these talks now?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Remember, Eritrea was a major player in the war against the TDF. So these meetings, they've kind of thrown everyone for a loop. Lots of people are trying to figure out what Afwerki's ultimate goal is. He's even promised protection for the TDF if they clash with Ethiopia again, but is that a real offer? Or is it just, a way to further destabilize the region?
Yeah, is he trying to use the TDF as leverage against Ethiopia?
It's a possibility.
Yeah.
And what about the risks for Eritrea by even engaging in these secret talks? A lot of unanswered questions that are keeping a lot of analysts up at night.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. And to make things even more complicated, we have to factor in the issue of Tigray's mining resources.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That throws another wrench in the works.
I mean, controlling those mines, that's serious economic power and influence. It's almost like adding fuel to the fire.
100%. Both Getachew and Debretsion want control. And that economic dimension just adds another layer of intrigue to their rivalry.
So we have these two Tigrayan leaders with very different approaches, both trying to secure their position in a region that's still reeling from a war. And they're caught between two nations with a long and hostile history. It's like they're playing a high-stakes game of chess where one wrong move could have disastrous consequences.
You hit the nail on the head. And as we dig deeper, the stakes just keep getting higher.
Yeah.
Especially when we start looking at the rising tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea since the Pretoria Agreement.
Oh, things are about to get even more interesting. We're going to save that juicy part for part 2 of our deep dive, so don't go anywhere. We'll be back to untangle this web of intrigue and try to figure out where this volatile situation is headed next. Okay, so welcome back. It feels like with this Tigray story, we uncover one layer and there's like 10 more underneath.
Yeah.
We were just talking about how the Pretoria Agreement, which everyone thought was going to bring peace, well, it hasn't exactly panned out that way. So what's going on there?
You know, you got to remember, peace agreements are usually just the beginning of a really long process.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And in this case, the agreement, it was barely signed before things started going south.
Yeah, the article mentions that both Ethiopia and Eritrea have been doing some pretty provocative things to each other. Like, Ethiopia has been hosting this Eritrean opposition group, and Eritrea went ahead and suspended all Ethiopian Airlines flights. It's like they're trying to one-up each other.
Yeah, it's like a dangerous game of, what's the word? Tit for tat.
Yeah, tit for tat, exactly.
And it's just creating more animosity, pushing them further apart. Makes you wonder if they were ever really serious about the peace agreement in the first place.
Right, like maybe it was just a temporary timeout.
Could be. And then you add in Abiy Ahmed's ambitions to get the port of Assab back, and it's like, whoa, this could blow up.
Oh yeah, Ethiopia lost access to that port during the '98 war, remember? If Abiy could get it back, that would be a huge win for him, strategically.
Huge. But it's a major sticking point for Eritrea. And I mean any attempt by Ethiopia to take control. That'd be seen as a declaration of war, pretty much.
Yeah, for sure. So it's like they need peace and stability, but then you've got these strategic interests clashing. It's a tough situation.
It is. Very classic geopolitical dilemma, really. And the scariest part is that all of this is happening in a region that's already super volatile.
Absolutely. And then in the middle of it all, you have the people of Tigray, who have already been through so much. They just went through a brutal civil war, and now they're facing the possibility of being pulled into another conflict.
It's heartbreaking. You know, they could end up as pawns in this bigger power struggle.
And this is where I start to get really worried, because there's also the chance that other countries could get involved.
Yeah, we can't rule that out.
Really? Other countries getting involved? Isn't that like the worst case scenario?
It's definitely a possibility. The Horn of Africa, geographically, it's strategically important, so you've got neighboring countries and global powers. They all have a stake in what happens there. And some of them might see the situation as a chance to take advantage, you know, to push their own agenda or maybe to try and limit the influence of their rivals.
So we could end up with a proxy war, with different countries backing different sides in Tigray. It sounds like something out of like a Cold War spy movie.
It's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. But what about the international community? Are they doing anything to try and prevent this whole thing from spinning out of control?
Good question.
Well, there have been some diplomatic efforts, mostly led by Western embassies. They're trying to assess the situation, encourage dialogue, and see if there's any way to de-escalate things.
So they're trying to be peacemakers?
Basically.
Yeah.
But have they had any luck? It doesn't really seem like things are getting any better.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, right?
Well, diplomacy takes time. You have to build trust, especially in a place with such a long history of conflict and, you know, a lot of suspicion.
Right. It's like everyone's starting from a place of who can we trust?
Yeah. And that makes it even harder to find common ground. So where does that leave us? What's the most likely scenario here? Are we headed for another war? Or is there a chance for peace?
I'm holding out hope for peace, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's really hard to say for sure. There are just so many factors at play, you know.
Yeah.
But I'd say based on what we know now, the most likely scenario is probably continued instability and tension. A full-blown war right away. Probably less likely. But smaller clashes, skirmishes, those are still a big risk.
So like a simmering conflict.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, there's always the chance of someone miscalculating or some random event happening that could spark a wider conflict. You just never know.
So we're in this dangerous waiting game where things could escalate really quickly. But you mentioned earlier that there are some glimmers of hope, right? What are some of the things that are giving you a little bit of optimism?
Well, it's easy to get caught up in all the bad news, but there are people in Tigray who are working really hard to create a more peaceful future.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Where are you seeing those signs of hope?
Well, one of the most inspiring things is the grassroots efforts happening within Tigray. There are people who are really committed to peace and reconciliation.
Like within the communities themselves?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Local leaders, religious figures, even civil society organizations.
Mm-hmm.
They're stepping up to try and bridge the divides, get people talking to each other again.
So it's about healing those old wounds and rebuilding trust, starting at the community level.
Exactly. They recognize that lasting peace has to come from within, and it has to address those root causes of the conflict. And that includes promoting forgiveness and understanding.
It's a long road, but it sounds like they're making some progress.
They are. It's encouraging to see.
It's really amazing to hear about those grassroots peace-building efforts. It's a good reminder that even with all this conflict, there are people who really want peace, and they're willing to work for it. But rebuilding after a war, it's not just about relationships. It's also about the economy. So how are they tackling that in Tigray? I mean, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge part of it. And it's where you see just how resilient the Tigrayan people are. Despite everything, there are entrepreneurs, small businesses popping up everywhere. They're determined to get the local economy going again.
So what kind of businesses are we talking about? Like what sectors are showing promise?
Well, a lot of them are focusing on traditional things, like agriculture, which has always been a big part of the Tigrayan economy. And others are going into trade, small-scale manufacturing, creating jobs and generating income within their communities.
It's great to see that entrepreneurial spirit, that refusal to give up. But they can't do it all on their own, can they? I mean, they need help to rebuild infrastructure, get those essential services back up and running.
You're right. They definitely need support.
Yeah.
And that's where international organizations and donor countries come in. There are groups working on the ground providing humanitarian aid, helping with infrastructure development, and investing in things like education and healthcare. All those crucial areas.
So it's kind of a multi-pronged approach, right? You've got local communities rebuilding trust, working to revive the economy, and then you've got international partners coming in with resources and expertise. Do you think this combined effort can really make a difference?
I think it can. It won't be easy, that's for sure, and it's going to take time. But there's a feeling that things are moving in the right direction, There are still huge challenges and things are still really fragile. But I think the resilience of the Tigrayan people and the support from the international community, it gives me hope for the future.
That's good to hear. So as we wrap up our deep dive into this Tigray situation, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think it's this. Even in the most difficult situations, even in situations like this that seem impossible, there's always hope. There are always people working towards peace, and there are always opportunities for positive change. It's easy to focus on the negative, but it's important to look for those glimmers of hope. Those stories of resilience and determination, they're out there.
That's a really important point. And I think it applies to more than just Tigray, It applies to conflicts and challenges all over the world. We need to look beyond the headlines and pay attention to those stories of hope and resilience that don't always get the attention they deserve.
Exactly, because those stories can inspire us, give us hope, remind us that even in the darkest times, humans can overcome incredible odds and build a better future. It's what we do.
Well said. Thank you so much for taking us on this deep dive. It's been a really eye-opening and thought-provoking journey.
It's been my pleasure, really.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We encourage you to keep learning about this topic, to look for different perspectives, and to remember that even when things seem impossible, hope is never lost. The story of Tigray is far from over, and we'll be here to follow it as it unfolds.